So I'll just read you from his book. I am not a scientist. I have studied and taught theology, religious history, ethics, and law. I received a Doctor of Ministry degree from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, a Juris Doctor degree from the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. School of Law at the University of California at Davis, and a PhD in History of Religion from the Graduate Theological School in Berkeley, California. I have taught and written about Christian faith, other religious traditions, and ethics. My most recent academic book is the third edition of Doing Environmental Ethics, published by Routledge in 2020.
Wow.
So, and then Robert said, well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to talk about this. I think you're qualified to probably talk about just about everything, Robert.
Wow.
So, Robert and I came across each other, maybe a year ago now, and sang in choir a bit, and Robert brought a piece to us about environmental ethics, which just really, well, it caused me to have a compost pan over under my sink now. So you did your job.
Well.
But we're very honored to have him, and I would like us to open with prayer. If you would please join me. Almighty and good God, we thank you this morning for another opportunity to learn about the mysteries of your world, to learn about the mysteries of your spiritual world. And we thank you that you have brought Robert with us to lead us in that discussion, and we pray that what we hear will guide us in gaining the truth of your word. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here and a privilege to share this with you. I'm going to share with you evidence, as I see it, of spiritual reality, relying on other folks who've had experiences that have been extraordinary in their lives, and who also have been transformed by those experiences and by research done as scientists about these kinds of extraordinary experiences. But I begin with my father. My father was a scientist. Actually, he had degrees from the University of Iowa in chemistry and pharmacology. And he was in the pharmaceutical industry for his working career. But before he died, he had a near-death experience. Those are often abbreviated NDEs, so you'll see that occasionally in this presentation. He'd never heard of an NDE, and so he was quiet after he'd had that experience about it because he thought it must be a hallucination. He was a scientist. There was no explanation. He died, or you could say, I'll put it this way, had a heart attack, cardiac arrest during surgery, and found himself up above his body. And as he saw that where he was, he knew that that couldn't be because there was no way to leave your physical body, and he could see that the medical team was trying to revive his heart. And then he went down through a dark tunnel. He came toward a bright light that he felt was full of love, and my mother, who was deceased, was in front of that light, and he wanted to stay. But she told him mentally, no, it's not your time, and then he found himself back in his physical body on the operating table. And he found that experience, based on his scientific training, as completely inexplicable and actually impossible. So it must have been something just hallucinatory, but after a couple of years, he realized it changed him. He lost his fear of death, had no fear at all of it. In fact, I won't say he looked forward to it, but he was very ready to die when his physical body told him it was time. And when that happened, after a second stroke, partly paralyzed, he rejected any kind of feeding tubes or any sort of additional care to keep his life going, and accepted that if the IV and the water were removed from his body, then he would die naturally in a short period of time. So that's what happened to him. And the picture that you saw earlier included our daughter Kim, who's the oldest daughter among us, who is adopted from Korea. And it's great of my father because he looks extremely warm and happy in that picture, which was not always my childhood experience of my father. But that's the way he was at the end of his life. Now, the Galileo Commission is a group of scientists founded in 2017, as you see, with an objective of expanding the worldview of science beyond its limiting materialistic assumptions, which are seldom examined by scientists. And one of these is the central assumption that the brain produces the mind, produces consciousness. And yet, as you'll see, there is evidence that this is not always the case, or the brain is not always producing, but actually is a vehicle for a transmission of experiences when people's brains are not working. So, insights from near-death experiences, this is language from the Galileo Commission report, insights from near-death experiences and other transformative experiences, like mystical experiences, suggest that we are all embedded within a larger field of consciousness with profound implications for ethics in an interconnected world. There's something we share, and in this book I'm calling that a spiritual reality. And I'll explain why I'm calling it that. There also is another group of scientists who have signed on to what's called a manifesto for post-materialist science. And it says in its opening statement, mind is fundamental in the universe, which is different than saying mind is a product of the brain. It cannot be derived from matter and reduced to anything more basic. Mind is fundamental. Consciousness, another word, is fundamental. Near-group experiences occurring in cardiac arrest, like my father's, coupled with evidence from research mediums, further suggest the survival of consciousness following bodily death and the existence of other levels of reality that are non-physical. A fundamental premise in science in the past century has been that everything is derived from physical activity, measurable. But I think if we think about our human experiences, we have thoughts and feelings that may be involved in terms of our experience of those attitudes, but they are not themselves physical. And you just think about it for just a moment. So this group of scientists who teach science, many of them, of course, are not a majority. And I'm not presenting to you the majority science position, still the part of the paradigm in our current society, but they are a significant group who've decided to become public in their understanding of the research that's available. And what I'll be presenting today is based on the scientists who also have become public about their experiences and their research. Early on, Dr. George Ritchie had an out-of-body near-death experience. He was at Camp Barkley, this is right in the war, and he was pronounced dead from double pneumonia, and yet he recalls waking up in the morgue, realizing he'd missed his transfer. He was supposed to be transferred to Virginia. He rushed out of the building and found himself flying east from the camp station, hospital over the Texas plains, and he saw below him town with blinking caution lights. He stopped at a city on the shore of a large river near an all-night cafe. He had these memories, even though he was out of his body and his brain wasn't functioning. And later, a team of scientists traced the path that he described from above and found that he had accurate observations of places he had never been physically. He had them from this out-of-death experience. There's other chairs if you want to come up, and don't hesitate. Now again, another early experience of an out-of-body experience and a near-death experience was Carl G. Jung, a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. Many of you are probably familiar with him. He had a near-death experience, cardiac arrest during surgery. And after that, he says, I was wakeful each night experiencing the complete vision, but not as an I. He experienced it instead as being united with somebody or something, as if in a silent, invisible festival permeated by an incomparable, indescribable feeling of eternal bliss, such as I could never have imagined as being within reach of human experience. He had a vision. He went up, not only out of his body, but up into the stratosphere and saw the Earth from above. And there had been no space travel, no satellites in 1944. So what he described as seeing was not verified until later. There was space travel and pictures of the Earth, and what he described was seeing part of Asia to a certain extent, and that just led scientists to say you have to be 9,000 miles in the air to have that kind of view. But that was part of his experience. So we're going to look today at near-death experience from the perspective of those who have had such an experience and described it, all scientists, or from the perspective of scientists who've done research on those who have had those experiences. Why choose scientists? Because they were educated not to believe something like this. So their testimony, I consider them witnesses of evidence. Their testimony to me is more credible on the surface, not that other testimony isn't credible, people are being honest. But these are people like my father who were trained to think the brain produces the mind. And that's it. And so when they say that's no longer an adequate statement, I think it carries more weight on the surface. So let's take a look. Next week, I will talk about consciousness, which is the larger issue of how we might now think about it as a field of consciousness, as these scientists are suggesting. So this is a list that of the folks you'll meet today in this presentation. Tony Sikoria, orthopedic surgeon. Lightning hit him in the face. He was trying to make a phone call, came through the phone line, knocked him out, made him unconscious on the ground. But he was out of his body, and he felt like he was flying, disconnected, but he was conscious. He saw his body. His mother-in-law, they were at a picnic area. His mother-in-law came screaming down the stairs. There was a building there, and he could see her, but she couldn't see him. She ran right by him, because looking only at his body. And as he moved up the steps, his feet were dissolving. And by the time he reached the head of the stairs, he was a ball of energy. His body disappeared, but his consciousness was recording this. He kept moving, went through the wall of the building without feeling anything. Then he saw this bluish white light that he knew somehow was absolute love surrounding him. He felt like he was a crystal stream of energy. And he could see that this energy made up everything and flows through it. The top says, I have to state this, the top line says that Sikoria then, a few weeks later, began to hear music in his head, and he knew that this music he wasn't creating it. Initially he had pain and some burning, but he continued as a doctor. But then he began to hear music, and he realized that this music was coming from somewhere, and he called it, when he wrote about it, music from heaven, because he knew he wasn't creating it, but he woke up with it and heard it. So he studied piano so he could play the music, and he studied composition, and he became a pianist who could play the music that came to him from heaven, recognizing that he didn't create the music, he simply performed it. Life changed. His life changed radically. Joyce Hawks, a biophysicist, cell research in a laboratory for years, studying the way of the mechanics of cells in the body. This heavy glass window off her mantel fell, hit her, knocked her unconscious, and she was suddenly out of her body, traveling down a dark tunnel, and was reunited with her grandmother and mother, who'd been dead for many years. And they were all embraced by what she described as a great light in the shape of a person, but taller and without distinct features. At Mount Shasta in Oregon, after hiking, several weeks after this experience, she entered a cave. There was a statue of Mary there holding her crucified son. Hawks was not religious, but knelt on the bench, sort of respectfully for where she was. And as she thought about what had happened to her in this experience, she heard a voice say, a woman's voice, "You are called to heal." And in her book, she writes, she couldn't say no to such a voice in such a circumstance. So she went back to her home, quit her job, and began to search out how to train to become a spiritual healer. And also, she, not having any sense of an afterlife, had a clear understanding that, yes, there was an afterlife where voices come and call you to new lives. Dr. Alan Hamilton, a neurosurgeon, was involved in saving the life of a woman who had an aneurysm in her brainstem, which required cooling her body using a heart-lung bypass machine to oxygenate and pump the blood back into her body after they'd taken it out in order to stop the blood flow so they could do the surgery in the brainstem. The surgeons had 20 minutes, no blood flow, cool body to get this fixed. And they succeeded, and then restored the patient's blood to her heart. All of this was videotaped, recorded, it was well documented. When Hamilton visited the patient in the recovery room, he was shocked when she told him of hearing conversations among the team, the surgical team, during her surgery. She heard a woman mention her engagement. She also could identify members of the surgical team by their appearance. She was unconscious with no blood flowing through her brain. The videotape documented when those conversations took place with respect to the surgical procedure. There was no blood in her brain when she heard and saw these things. And the medical team had no background to enable them to explain this event. But they documented by asking her questions, and they knew then that she did have perceptions, comprehension, and memory, all of which are supposed to not be happening when you're under an anesthetic, or especially when you have no blood flow in your brain. And she had both, no anesthetic and no blood flow. Dr. Kircher, Pamela Kircher, a hospice physician, at age 6 suffered from meningitis, and she found herself at that young age above her body, but feeling not like a child, but feeling more like later she understood it was like being an adult. She had the strong sense that she was surrounded by God, not that God was a person, but surrounded by God, and that her soul had existed before she came into her body and would exist when this life was over. She said, "I've come to understand how tiny the distance is between the world we inhabit and the world of the spirit." There's not a good photograph of her online, so I used the cover of her book. Otherwise, I would have used, as I'll do for the other slides, a facial photograph. She also writes in her book about what she calls spiritually transformative experiences, where there isn't a near-death experience, but in a sense, the consciousness becomes the same, and it has a transforming impact on the life of people. You know, if we want to jump back 2 millennia, we could think of St. Paul. He had an experience, life-transforming, an experience he couldn't explain. It came from outside of him. It included voices and maybe a vision. She writes, "These experiences, like near-death experiences, have life-altering consequences." A scientist who was a friend of hers was a confirmed atheist, but after his spontaneous mystical experience, suddenly he understood the universe and knew it was unfolding, and that was his language, in exactly the way it needs to. He could see how everything relates to everything else and how truly beautiful and intricate it all is. Dr. Anderson.
Excuse me, what was her name again?
Her name was Pamela Kircher.
Thank you.
And her book is Love is the Link. Love is the Link.
Thank you.
Dr. Reggie Anderson was a Christian physician explicitly, not simply background, but convicted adult Christian. And he was the doctor of Eunice, who had a heart attack in his hospital, but he had a very small hospital in a small community, and she was taken to Nashville to be dealt with there. And there she spent 2 hours in a resuscitation process with a physician and a resident helping him. but they failed to restart her heart. And then when they were packing up all the equipment, her heart started to beat. 2 hours without heartbeat. They were astonished, had no explanation. 3 days later, she woke up from her coma without any apparent damage to her brain or mental state. And she said she had a message for Dr. Anderson, her home doctor. And that message, after sharing with Dr. Anderson her experience out of her body and in a place where she was meeting her deceased relatives in a beautiful field environment, she said Jesus came to her and asked her to go back to tell Dr. Anderson he was doing God's will by remaining in the Ashland City Hospital, and he had been pondering whether he should stay or not. Jesus also told Eunice that she would soon be returned to be with her family and friends in heaven. And she soon experienced a peaceful death. And Reggie Anderson writes this account of her experience and his experience. Now, Dr. Rajiv Party, an American, but Hindu background, not religious, but you'll see how that background affects his experience. Unconscious now during surgery, anesthetized, he shouldn't be able to experience anything, but suddenly he's out of his body like these other folks, near the ceiling, watching as an anesthesiologist the surgery on himself and aware of the conversations again. He later reports hearing what's being said in the hospital room and seeing what's going on. Out of his body, he could see his mother in New Delhi, went and visited her while he's also sort of seeing the surgical operating room at the same time. But he couldn't interact with her in any way. He tried to touch her and nothing happened. But soon he moved through darkness to the rim of a flaming canyon, which he knew was hell, which the Hindi word is naraka. And there he heard a voice saying, "You have led a materialistic and selfish life," which he knew when he heard it was true. His patients were a source of his wealth. And he had had a previous patient himself who had said, "I want to tell you about my experience," and he had written it off as meaningless, hallucination. His deceased father appeared to him, saying, "If you are truthful to your own self, the divine, the universe, will take care of you." Party reviewed his life, and many people who have these experiences get a life review experience where they see their life rapidly, but they see it at a feeling level, not only in their own self, but in terms of the other person's, their feelings at the same time. It's a self-judgment process. It's not a divine judgment of them. It's a process to learn from. He reviewed his current life, but also 2 previous lives, one as a harsh plantation owner in India, and another as the addicted owner of a poppy farm in Afghanistan. A being of light told Party he was to become a healer of the soul. And interestingly enough, Christian saints, Michael and Raphael, guided Party over his transition into the life of a spiritual meditative healer. Dr. Janice Amatuzio, a forensic pathologist, documents the near-death experience of a patient of hers in her book, Forever Ours, Real Stories of Immortality. He describes, in the book, leaving his body behind and traveling through the wall of the hospital and along a multicolored pathway toward a dazzling light before he returned to his body. She writes about her father's experience as well, who was also a physician. During surgery, he had a heart attack, left his body, traveled to a beautiful place where his deceased family members and friends were gathered. He wanted to join them, like my father, but they indicated it wasn't his time. After he returned to his body, his physician confirmed his heart had stopped beating for 15 minutes. And he said, "You were dead and gone," because that was the understanding. If your heart's not beating for 15 minutes, that you're not there. But he was there, elsewhere, someplace else. Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon, is among the more famous of these scientists because his book has been so widely distributed. 25 years as a neurosurgeon, obviously well informed about the brain, suddenly was in a coma with bacterial meningoencephalitis, which is sort of both things happening together. After a week in this coma with no responsiveness, his physicians recommended ending life support. But then he awakened, and he said, all will be well. His experience of heaven included seeing a brilliant orb of light which communicated to him that there were many universes powered by the Creator's love, each with evil as well as free will choices. In his book, Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife, he laments that the worldview of science is opposed to even considering the spiritual reality that he experienced. This other vastly grander universe, he affirms, exists on a different frequency. But it's right here, right now. And we're unaware of it because we are, for the most part, closed to those frequencies on which it manifests. When he uses the word like frequencies, he's also thinking of consciousness as like a field and spiritual reality as kind of a field where you're either tuned into it or you're not. And these folks all become, without necessarily any choice, when it happens, tuned into that. Nancy Ryan, a young atheist scientist, atheist, not that she was preaching about it, but she simply was. Nothing else made sense to her. My first near-death experience, she says, happened when the truck initially struck her and took her under the wheels. My consciousness was in two places, she writes. One part, animal-like and very scared, was firmly inside my broken body that was being dragged under the truck. The other part, a calm, dispassionate observer, hovered out in front of the truck, watching the whole scene unfold from a distance, out of her body, but in this case also in her body, aware of both. Later during surgery, my consciousness was ultimately brought to a place unlike anything I have ever experienced. The beauty and utter peace defies human words. I felt totally calm, loved, and whole. I also felt a deep, profound sense of love permeating everything there. She writes on her website that she is now a spiritual seeker, as well as a practitioner of compassion, kindness, contemplative prayer, and present moment awareness. Dr. Laura Belg, an ICU physician, writes in her book, Near Death in the ICU, Stories from Patients Near Death and Why We Should Listen to Them. She describes a patient, which she calls in her book Dr. John by the first name, who wasn't afraid of death, he's told her, because he died twice during World War II. He died during surgery for abdominal wounds and experienced hovering above the operating table. But after his coughing tore open his abdomen and caused massive bleeding, he died again and traveled to a beautiful place of total love. Dr. John regrets not sharing his experience until he shared it with Dr. Belk, just before his own death. If only I'd had the courage, he says, to tell my dying patients the same thing happened to me, I would have done them a great service. I was too concerned, however, with my own reputation and with what my colleagues and patients would think of me. Even as my own wife lay dying, I didn't have the courage to tell her that I believed something wonderful waited for her on the other side. And I have to say, this remains one of the greatest regrets of my life. Now, in the second part of my book, I'm looking at research done on this issue of near-death experiences. I show the cover words again because I see this as verifying spiritual reality. The word verifying is a word referring to subjective experience and, to some extent, consistency among those experiences, which gives an objective rather than a subjective point of view. In other words, it's like a court of law. You get people making testimony, and you cannot prove by direct objective measurements that they're telling the truth, but you make a decision about whether their reasoning and experiences as they share them are truthful, rational, make sense. That's verifying. And the word spiritual is crucial because you'll find that these experiences often contain that word. Rarely do they contain the word religious. People experience this not as religious because they don't experience it connected to a religious set of beliefs or practices, because most of them never had that. They experience it as something, a part of reality that they call spiritual because it's not material. And rather than use the word immaterial, which is a negative way of saying it's not material, they experience it as spiritual. And it's a reality for them. So that explains the title of the book. Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer, psychoanalyst. In 1991, her daughter's hand-carved and valuable harp was stolen. Police were unable to locate it. A friend suggested, why don't you try a dowser? Well, she said, what? No, try it. And she said, I have nothing to lose. So she called a dowser in Arkansas. She was in California. 2 days later, the dowser told her the harp was on a block of a particular street in Oakland, California. She posted lost notices on telephone poles in the block, and with the help of a neighbor who called her and said, I know where your harp is, she recovered that harp. This experience changed her life because it was so improbable, unbelievable, and she was a scientist and thought, I have to try to understand how this could possibly happen. So she began to do research on extraordinary knowing. That's how she entitled her book. Science, skepticism, she was a skeptic professionally, and the inexplicable powers of the human mind. A dowser? What kind of power is that? Dr. Pim van Lommel, cardiologist, Dutch, discovered among his patients that some of them had memories during cardiac arrest, which he couldn't explain and found and was being ignored. Actually, nobody was recording it or interviewing the patient, so he began a research project interviewing all his cardiac arrest patients who survived, of course, otherwise he couldn't interview them. And those patients, not all of them, but many of them, had these experiences and described them. So by 2012, he published this article, Near-Death Experiences, the experience of the self as real and not as an illusion. And in the article, he reported on these survivors who have experienced perceptions from outside their bodies when their brains had no measurable EEG activity. And he was one of the earliest of the contemporary kinds of witnesses to speak publicly because it's a career potentially breaker, but he was well established in his career and he took that risk. He writes in a review of 93 corroborated reports of potentially verifiable out-of-body perceptions during a near-death experience, about 90% were found to be completely accurate. Van Lommel noted that cardiac arrest survivors often recall meeting deceased relatives or friends during their near-death experiences. Also, patients survey their whole life at one glance. In this life review, time and space do not seem to exist. It's not like a movie where you have a sense of time. It's somehow all one, happening without time or place. And patients experience not only their past, but also the feelings of those helped or harmed by their past actions. Dr. Fenwick and his wife, Elizabeth Fenwick. Here's 4 books they've written together. But they say, as you see in this video image of one of their videos, death is an expansion of consciousness. And that's what they feel their research supports. They've done surveys, and here are some of the results from their survey. 82% said they have less fear of death. 48% believed in life after death. Probably not before. 42% shared they were more spiritual. Again, that was the word chosen. Majority of people do not identify as religious, but they identify the experience they've had as spiritual. 40% felt more concerned about social justice. That's interesting. So it's not just, I want to go to heaven. It changes the view of their reality. 47% thought they'd become more sensitive. Dr. Raymond Moody, lots of books, research over 30 years, also had during this 30-year period a near-death experience. But one of the most well-known names as a researcher. In one of his books, Glimpses of Eternity, Moody describes this experience shared with him by a psychologist in North Carolina, who said, although I'm not religious, hospice work has awakened me to a spiritual dimension of life. In my opinion, everyone who works with the dying long enough must have some awareness of these experiences. I believe the spiritual experiences of dying people somehow leaks out and pervades the area around them. If you step into that area with the right temperament, you will receive, I feel, a sense of the sacred in the presence of the dying. Dr. Jeffrey Long, radiation doctor, founder and director of an organization called NDERF, Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. And he's written 2 books, small letters here, Evidence of the Afterlife, God in the Afterlife, documenting from the website, NDERF website, surveys and responses of people all over the world, thousands of them, who say they have had these experiences and report them. Now, from the perspective of Dr. Long, being demonstrably near death and having an experience that includes this spiritual quality, and then returning are sort of the criteria of being a good witness, you could say. So, Evidence of the Afterlife, the one book, reports on more than 1,000 surveys completed on the website. He says, Long evaluated these responses by applying what he considers the scientific principle. What is real is consistently seen among many different observations. He argues that this is the legal, reasonable person standard applied in courtrooms to assess witness testimony, which is inherently subjective. Dr. Bruce Grayson is a psychiatrist, researched near-death experiences for over 30 years. Most interestingly, his new book, indicated at the bottom, After, a doctor explores what near-death experiences reveal about life and beyond. His new book is based on surveying 20 years later those who are still living that he surveyed before to see if the experiences retained the same memory quality, because he had records, and the same importance in the lives of the people who had them. Most memories, many of us who are older now can attest to this, diminish or alter. And in fact, lots of research showed that memory is flexible, and as we have other distant experiences, the more we remember something, the more we change it. That was not the case in repeating these surveys. Memories were accurate 20 years later. Memories were just as important. So many of Grayson's colleagues dismiss near-death experiences as fantasy. This is an obvious fact. His response to that is that what makes an investigation scientific is not the topic, but whether the study reflects rigorous observations, clear reasoning, and evidence that can be evaluated. For instance, a researcher named Jan Holden reviewed 93 cases of out-of-body perceptions during NDEs and proved that 92% were verified by outside sources as completely accurate. If you want to get one book for your library, the book After would be the book I would recommend. I'll recommend the second book in a moment, but that one. So I'm going to give 2 more quotes from that book. I give you the little image up in the right-hand corner. There's a butterfly there. What do we think of with butterflies? Transformation. That's the key thing that he found in his research. Lives were transformed. And hallucinations don't generally do that to people. They're chaotic. The result is more chaos in their life rather than transformation. So these are encounters, people claiming with the divine. Whether you think that's true or not, these are life changes for people. 2/3 responding to his survey said that in their near-death experience they saw or sensed the presence of a deceased loved one. 90% of those interviewed said they encountered a divine or godlike being during their NDE. Of those, most did not know who this being was, and yet they felt loved and at home. Terribly interesting observations. Not like Reggie and Eunice, who identified Jesus. They knew who they were dealing with, but most did not, and most had more like Joyce Hawks, a loving light without any distinct features to identify sort of who that light is. Grayson suggests that these experiences undermine the claim that near-death experiences simply reflect one's religious heritage or upbringing, unconscious memories that are in your past, because most of these, 4 out of 5 affirmed an increased faith in a higher power, as well as an inner awareness of that power. Spiritual life began for most people with this experience. Here's another book, Dr. Christopher Kerr, hospice physician. This begins such an interesting way. He reports that after sitting beside thousands of dying patients, he realized that his view of death and dying had changed. Often, as they felt bodily pain, they nonetheless told him of their wondrous dreams and visions. Patients described these experiences as more real than real. And many told Kerr that these spiritual experiences, and that was the word they were using, had overcome their fear of dying. Kerr says he has witnessed many times the quiet process of peaceful surrender and well-being, which he describes as the version of grace and spirituality that takes my patients over the threshold of pain and suffering. Crucial in this transition are the end-of-life dreams and visions, which Kerr explains are spiritual in the manner in which they alter perception and in the sense of well-being they provide. If you think of a second book for your library in the church, Death is But a Dream by Kerr, K-E-R-R. Next week, consciousness, extraordinary knowing, different ways that consciousness manifests itself in an intuition, kind of words we use, but we don't understand what it means really or how it works. Healing, there's a lot of examples of healings that are inexplicable. Visions, dreams, mystical experiences. And yet still in science today we have what I would call scientific mysteries, which generally scientists say, well, we'll explain those at some point. But they have to do with subjective experience. Scientists focus on objective, the verifiable, measurable facts, and that's good. I mean, I come from a family of scientists. I have 3 kids who are scientists. But subjective experience tends to get lost in terms of what's real if it's simply a brain product, because then it's not, somehow it doesn't have its own quality, its own reality. It's a product of neurons. Purpose and meaning. There's a great deal of literature you'll see, not that you'll see much of it, that there's no verifiable purpose in our life here or in the universe, because materialism doesn't have any place for a verifiable purpose. Everything just runs by the causality of material reality. And then nature and God. Is the nature we're in without purpose? What happens in nature? Is it all just mechanism? Is it all just the past makes the future, period? And God, where is God? Well, without a spiritual reality, it's very hard to talk about God. So, I end then with a brief reflection on light and love. The 2 images I use for God, based largely on this kind of research, near-death experiences, and in my own personal prayer now, light and love. God is light and love. And if you stop and think about it, even in the materialistic side of our reality, light is inexplicable. It's not just coming from the sun. It behaves in ways as particle or waves. I mean, we don't have adequate explanation of what we call light, or even our way of projecting out into the world what we see, which is not projected in our minds and then projected out. It's all put together with limited perception. So mostly what's out there we're not seeing. We're creating. I'm sorry to tell you, I'm creating the vision that I have in the view now. But I'm not seeing all of what's coming, because the brain filters most of what comes through hearing, through eyes, and there are no pictures, there are no music, sounds in your brain. We're filtering, we're creating the life we're experiencing. So we're going to talk more about that next time. And now I'm happy to respond to any sorts of questions you might have.